was this small production company called Carolco, and they had made Rambo 1, which was a modest success, but sort of a sensation internationally. And
It was a cultural success, tremendous cultural
yeah,
success.
it became, Rambo became almost part of the language, right? But we were the only independent company that has ever had back-to-back #1 worldwide grossers with Terminator 2 and Basic Instinct. Those are two probably the most known.
So this was a legitimate mistake. Humans make mistakes. A legitimate mistake that was made not by you, but by your accountant. And they decided to make an example of you and charge you even though you were willing to reconcile the mistake? Hello, friends. This is Michael Levine with another edition of Without Notes. Today, our partner for the expedition is a Hollywood icon who had a magnificent fall from grace and a recovery from that fall. So it's a rise, fall, and rise story of Peter Hoffman, a Hollywood icon responsible for some of the most culturally impactful movies in the last 3 decades. So I look forward to our journey today with Peter Hoffman. Welcome to Without Notes, Peter.
Good to be here, Michael.
My friend, let us begin the journey. Where were you born?
I was born in Washington, D.C., 1949, at the Columbia Hospital for Women, just right off Washington Circle.
And you lived in Washington, D.C. when you were being raised?
No. My father was in the Pentagon in the Minuteman missile program. And so he and my mother were living temporarily, actually, in Alexandria. But I was born, they came into the city for my birth. So I was born in D.C. And then we only spent a couple of years in Alexandria, a lot of time when he was in SINCPAC during the Korean War. And then he and my mother split up, and then he moved up to Rhode Island, where he was at the War College, and then on to Connecticut.
And where were you raised? Now, your parents divorced when you were a very young child?
Yeah, about 3 years old.
Okay. Any brothers and sisters?
One brother, and 3 half sisters and 1 half brother. My mother remarried, and so she had another family in Canada.
And was the brother older or younger?
Younger, 18 months younger.
Okay. All right. So you're the oldest son, oldest child. Where were you raised? Because the divorce.
My earliest years I can remember were in Stamford, Connecticut, when my father was working for AMF. But when we were around 7 or 8, I moved to a town called Fairfield, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio, where my father was an executive at the Champion Paper Company. And I lived there through the graduation from high school.
And so you then, as your story unfolds, it sounds like you lived with your father during your formative years.
I did, yes.
So now you leave high school. Where do you go to college?
Yeah, sure. I went to actually the same school that my father went to, a little Methodist school called Drew University in Madison, New Jersey, very close to where my father's family had settled when they came over from Germany in the 1840s.
Had I met you as a junior, senior in college, and I said, Peter, what are you going to do? What do you want to do with this absolutely impeccable brain and this triple major? What the hell are you going to do with this?
Well, I really wanted to go to the Yale Law School. That was my goal, or second Stanford. Both my grandfather and my uncle went to Stanford, and my mother was actually one of the youngest women ever, one of the first women ever admitted to the Stanford Law School before she dropped out to marry my father. She was also an extremely intelligent woman, as was my father. They met at Stanford when he was in the PhD program, and she was a first-year law student. I wanted to go to either Stanford or Yale, and I had the good fortune to get accepted at Yale.
Now, with your family having such a rich tradition of going to Stanford, what appealed to you? I mean, Yale is an outstanding school, obviously, but why wouldn't you want to naturally go to Stanford? What about Yale appealed to you?
It's so long ago, I don't know that I have a coherent answer to that. It's
Except
just,
that it was an outstanding school.
yeah, and one funny memory that sticks is when Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters camped in the quad there at the Yale Law School. They have a quad, and there was a lot of protests, and the law school was kind of known for its very aggressive politics, and I was in those days a very progressive thinker. And so, it seemed like that was the happening place to be. And because it's like a third of the size of the Harvard Law School, and even a third of the size of Stanford, it's the far and away the most selective law school in the country. At least it was in those days.
Okay.
So be accepted there was a big deal.
Oh, yeah, it's a huge deal. So you get accepted, you go to Yale Law School, and then the goal is to become an attorney. And then what? Tell us the next part of the journey.
After I uh, graduated, I clerked for a year for a judge, and the guy who was the chief judge of the D.C. Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. So I went back there, and I actually got an apartment literally across the street from the Columbia Hospital for Women. And that was an incredible experience because I got very close to that judge. Dave Bazelon wrote some incredible, I mean, we had some incredible cases that came up, 74, 75, all the Watergate appeals, the 7 words you can't say on TV, the pension plan, fairness doctrine program, on and on and on. And it was just an incredible year. But I had kind of made up my mind that I wanted to go to Los Angeles because my first wife was from Los Angeles. And I still had the connection to California because my mother's family were longtime Californians. They had come on the wagon trains in 1850. So, there was.
And what year is this, Peter? What year is this?
I clerked from 75, 76, and I came to LA in 76.
Right. Peter, I want to announce I came to Los Angeles in 1977, September 16th. You came in 76. And it is important, I think, for the viewers all over the world to grasp or attempt to grasp what a paradise Los Angeles was in those years. Hollywood, Los Angeles, it is a very different environment today. But going to Los Angeles in the 70s, going to Hollywood, was like entering a realm of paradise. It was filled with optimism, and the weather was extraordinary, and it was just such a exciting time. Is that your memory?
Yeah, sure was. It was. I loved Los Angeles, always have, with all the criticisms of it. Nevertheless, I found it a great place to live, and stayed here since now what 50 odd years. So. Yeah, I love the city then and still do.
Yes, it's a very different city today, very different environment. Hollywood is very different. It has taken it's had great difficulties in the last several years. So let's go on. Now, you come to Hollywood, you're in Los Angeles in 1976. You got this extraordinary legal pedigree. And what becomes of the great Peter Hoffman at that point in the story?
Well, I was hired at a law firm called Irell in Manila,
Yep.
and they had
Rather
interviewed.
major, rather major law firm in Los Angeles.
They're really big today. In those days, there were only like 30 some lawyers, and they were specialized in particularly high-end tax planning, which is what interested me. Because despite all the large public interest stuff I was working on when I clerked for Judge Bazelon, my goal was to have 50% of my time being in more or less public interest and progressive stuff, and 50% on the most complicated, difficult tax analysis that you could have. And Irell was the place. And also a guy who I got to know at Yale was 1 year ahead of me, named Robert E. Gibson is his name, but everyone calls him Reg. Reg said, you really got to go to Irell in Manila. And I met several of the senior lawyers there, was very impressed, and particularly by one of the guys who was officially of counsel named Larry Stone. because at Yale, was taught by Boris Bitker, who was kind of the dean of the tax practice in America, wrote the leading treatise. And the textbook we had at Yale was Bitker Stone. Larry was the co-writer with Boris Bitker of our tax textbook. And he was formerly high up in Treasury and, really just a first-rate mind. And Art Armstrong and Werner Wolfen, I mean, they were just some really first-rate lawyers. And so I was very attracted to both their willingness to let me run off and do a bunch of other things and still be involved in some of the most complex tax planning available.
Okay, so you're there. How long do you stay at Irel in Manila?
I left January 1, 1983.
Okay.
What I had became a partner very quickly in 1980 after 5 years, but I very rapidly developed a big book of business, and yet they weren't really paying me right, and they were charging stuff for capital, and everybody was saying, look, you can make a lot more money elsewhere, and Reg Gibson he had left to go to a firm that was a very famous then entertainment firm, Armstrong, Hendler and Hirsch. That was
Right.
the Armstrong and a guy named Gary Hendler, who were both partners at Irel, and Barry Hirsch, who's kind of a legend in the film business.
Barry Hirsch, for our viewers, is a Hollywood icon, legal icon. Is that fair?
Yeah, oh yeah, and a practicing psychologist as well, as you may know.
Psychiatrist, I believe.
Yeah, I think it's a psychologist, but nevertheless,
Psychologist. Okay,
yeah.
fair enough.
But in
But a
any event,
very interesting man.
very interesting, and he can be a pain in the butt, as we learned a couple of times. But he became a good friend of the family later when,
Interesting men often are pains in the butt.
right.
So,
So Reg originally said, "Look, why don't you come over and join Armstrong, Hendler, and Hirsch?" And both Gary Hendler, who at that time was kind of one of the leading lawyers in the entertainment world, and Barry were making a big pitch for me. And then Reg said, "No, no, you know what? We should form our own firm." So he convinced me that we should form our own firm, which we did, Gibson, Hoffman, and Pansion, which opened its doors in January 1, 1983.
and you said you had a big book of business. What was your secret sauce for attracting business as a young attorney? What did you do well that others didn't do quite as well that allowed you to sign a large number of clients in an early part of your career?
Well, one of the things that happens when you're practicing law is it isn't just how good you are, it's what opportunities are presented to you to show what you can do. And to not just what your knowledge is, but also that you can get results for clients that they all talk about. And, learning how to deal with clients. Another sort of legend in the Hollywood legal community was a guy named Ken Ziffren. And Kenny
Oh,
was,
yes.
Ken. And Ken's father actually was a law partner with Dave Bazelon. And so when I came to LA, Bazelon said, "You really go see this lawyer, Ken Ziffren." And, I got to know him, and Ken sort of became a little bit of a mentor for me, him and his partner, Skip Brittingham, who were probably the single most important lawyers in the television business. And
Without
Kenny,
exception. Without
yeah,
exception.
Kenny said something that I always remembered. He said, Peter, you always have to be ahead of the client. If you're not ahead of the client and the client's telling you what his problem is, you're already now behind the client and he's losing confidence in you.
What
So
great
he gave
life
us the
advice.
things the client hadn't thought of, really.
What great
Um,
life advice. It's so interesting, Peter. I think you may have observed this in your life. People are where they are because of who they are. The reason that Ken Ziffren became Ken Ziffren is because he was Ken Ziffren. He had this ability to distill wisdom into a very commonsensical thought. You got to be ahead of the client. So that's great. So you start your own firm. That must have been scary as hell. What was that like?
it should have been, and for some reason, because we had a particular book of business, both Reg did and I did, that we felt pretty confident about our ability to actually do better on our own than we were at each of our firms, which we did actually in our first year.
Now,
Um,
you right away had success in your firm.
yeah, I mean, what had happened was that it was really by accident. One of the early things that I was given assigned at Irela Manila were the issues involving this film producer, Alexander Salkind, who was sort of a legendary family a Russian-German family. His father
Superman.
made Street Without Joy, and Alex was making pictures, in the 40s and 50s, and he had put together the financing in this very screwy way to make the original Superman. He had
Right,
convinced DC Comics before anybody thought about doing movies based on comic strips,
right.
and he created Superman 1 and 2, and in the course of doing that, as the Warner executive in charge said to me once, he said, Alex has more problems than God. All right. So, which was good news for a young lawyer who wants to show what he
Yeah,
can do. All right.
yep, right.
And, uh, and
A lot of
so
lot of billable hours.
a lot of bill hours, but a lot of, as it turns out in the film business, a lot of deals where a lot of money is changing hands, which
Yep.
is where you really get paid. And particularly when we're doing tax preference deals, because I did a bunch of tax preference deals. That was my first deal for Alex, was a tax deal on Superman 2. And then we started dealing with all of his problems. He had this huge tax problem in Switzerland, and we had to move him out of Switzerland. But the biggest problem we're solving the participations due on Superman 1 and 2. He owed Brando $14 million. He owed Donner and Puzo 6 or 7 million, and Warner weren't going to make number 3 or Supergirl if they didn't solve those participation problems. And Warner was still recouping because they had gone so far over budget on the 2 pictures. And so the issue was, how do we settle those cases and settle them in a way Alex could do it? And that was the first, um, what I'll call signature deal I did that sort of created an enormous reputation for me in the business at a very young age. And it was basically figuring out how to settle the Brando lawsuit. Brando was owed about $14 million. And we kind of settled it so that we would pay 7 or 8, but his lawyer, again, was very famous in those days, Norman Gary. He had to go to Marlin and not say, look, you're getting half the money because I screwed up and didn't get a direct payment from Warner. So, we have to be able to show him that he's getting the same after taxes as he would have got if he had been paid what he was supposed to have been paid. And that was the deal where we were able to buy Brando's loan out company, Penny Poke Farms, buy his stock and get capital gains for him. Later, that's how I got to know Tom Pollock, who sort of became a legend. And Tommy was kind of then the guy always referring me to everybody. And Tom and I sort of he offered me several times to join his firm, but I wanted to stay with Reg. But we worked on all the deals together. And yeah, Tommy
And
later
when
said,
you,
you should have copyrighted those papers you did for the Brando deal. Everybody's copying them. I said, great. What can I do?
all right, fair enough. So now, after this firm meets with some success, what becomes your next journey?
Well, one of the clients I had was this small production company called Carolco, and they had made Rambo 1, which was a modest success, but sort of a sensation internationally. And
It was a cultural success, tremendous cultural
yeah,
success.
it became, Rambo became almost part of the language, right?
Not
But it was number
almost.
two. Number two was the one that really broke out. So I did a lot of work with them on, getting number 2 ready. And as number 2 was coming and they knew it was going to be a big hit, they started bugging me about joining their company as the president and CEO. So we would go raise money and really build the company beyond the success of First Blood and Rambo 2. And they started on me. I still remember the lunch we had on the weekend that the Rambo 2 opened, Memorial Day weekend, 1985. We were in New York together, and I was there on a bunch of Canon business because that was my biggest client in those days was Canon Pictures. And we had dinner, and they kept pushing me, and I said, okay, sounds good. And there were reasons why it was time for me to move on, and they offered me a lot of money. And so as of April 1st, 1986, I became president and CEO of Carolco Pictures.
Wow, what an extraordinary opportunity for you. And then take us through the next 10 years. What happens? I mean, you're in a powerful position and your presence in Hollywood is unquestionable at this point. Then what happens?
Well, I mean, the first thing we did, and one of the reasons they hired me was they wanted to go public, raise a lot of public money. So we were able to go public on the New York Stock Exchange, and created quite a nice value for the company. And then we started making some serious movies. We then bought the video company and a couple of other companies in my so-called diversification strategy. And between 1986 and when I left the company at the end of my second contract in in April of 1992, Carolco became, was it nine? Yeah, 86, 92, right? 80, we were king of the hill,
What are
number one.
some of the movies you made during that time? Give us some names of movies that we might be aware of.
Well, we were the only independent company that has ever had back-to-back number one worldwide grossers with Terminator 2 and Basic Instinct. Those are two probably the most known. In addition to Rambo 2, we did Rambo 3, which was somewhat of a disappointment. But then there was a number of other pictures we did that sort of took on a life of their own as kind of special movies. We had Cliffhanger with Stallone, which was a big success. But more important were movies like Jacob's Ladder, which sort of became a cult classic, Angel Heart, which became a cult classic, The Doors, which to me was one of my favorite movies that we made.
Yes.
Um, and
Yes. The Doors.
we probably made 40 movies in that period of time, that 6 years. But those are kind of some of the high points on it. And that was when I really started learning not just about how to raise money and do deals, and I did some pretty interesting deals. Just getting the rights to Terminator 2 was quite a deal, maybe the best deal I did for Carolco.
Then after you leave there, what becomes of you next?
Well, I decided to work with Mike Medavoy, who had left TriStar. I'd worked with him.
Hollywood legend.
Yeah. So Mike asked me to help him form his own company called Phoenix Pictures.
That's
And so we got
right.
a deal over at Sony, and we went and started raising money. And over the next year and a half, we were able to raise the money for Phoenix to get started. But it was really something, there wasn't a role for me in that other than getting him set up. And he was working also with Arnie Messer. But we get it started, and in that time I decided to try and make a couple of pictures on my own. And so in that period, I made four pictures on my own, Johnny Mnemonic being probably the most well known of them.
Right.
And then I decided that I wanted to go on and have my own company, Seven Arts, which was a
Right.
logo that we had acquired at Carolco. That had Warner's that used to own the label. It was originally Warner Seven Arts, and one of the first independent companies that went public in the 1950s. But Warner's, I called the general counsel of Warner's, and he said, "Look, we don't use the mark anymore. If you go register it, we won't object." So that's what we did.
Now
And
what
so
year
then
are
I
we
made a deal with two guys, with a guy named Jay Firestone, who was a guy from Canada that I'd worked with at Carolco, who was part of a company called Alliance. And also, we made a deal at Paramount. But I'm missing one big step. In the same time, when I'm working with Mike and setting up Phoenix Pictures, also, right after I'd left Carolco, Harvey Weinstein approaches me and says, "Look, Bob and I want you to really be part of our team, help us get going, decide what we're going to do with our company." And so I became a consultant for them. I didn't want to join the company, and honestly, then I was there when we made the great deals, buying out the British investors for nothing, selling the company to Disney for $92 million, the buyout of the back end of Crying Game, the things that sort of turned that company around. And then and that sort of went out when I basically set up my own Paramount deal with Colleen Camp, and
Yeah.
with the support of Sherry Lansing and John Dolgen, who were also legends in the business. And that started the 6 years that I had at Paramount. So we'll call it 6 years at Carolco, call it 3 years independent, 6 years at Paramount. That was sort of um, the kind of core of the career making movies.
All right. Now the story is going to emerge with some clouds and darker days as we move forward, which is the subject of your new book. You have a book that's coming out in shortly. What is the title of your book, friend?
Sure. Karmic Wins,
Karmic.
colon, reflections of the quote, smartest guy in Hollywood.
Okay. So let's talk about some of the content, meaning the fall. There is a tremendous fall that ensues. So let's talk about the setup to the fall, and then the fall, and then the rise again. So let's talk about that.
Well, it starts really in strange ways. Since as you know, as you and I have spoken, I consider so many things that happen fated, and
Yep.
rise and fall themselves are things that are sometimes beyond our control.
Yep.
And in my case, the problems really started when Jose Menendez was murdered, because he was running our video company. I had hired him to run the video company, and his death created a whole series of problems and put us under the spotlight. Because when it first happened, everybody seemed to think it was Mario Casar and I who were somehow responsible for this.
Yep.
And then while that was happening, there was an article that was in the calendar section of the LA Times. They have that Sunday section, and they had a picture of Mario Casar on there called the $1 billion man, after we had the success with Terminator 2.
Right.
And in there they talked
By the
about.
way, the Los Angeles Times at that point in the story is a powerful news organization. Unlike today, it is tremendously powerful. So go ahead.
And being on the cover of Calendar magazine was a big deal.
Big
And in
deal.
the writer talked about the foreign tax structure I had set up for this for the company, which basically meant we weren't paying any U.S. taxes. All right. And what was more important was that when Casar and I bought out Andy Vina, his original partner, I had structured it so that the money that Andy got, the $110 million, back when that was a lot of money, was all received in the islands and not subject to U.S. tax. And that was discussed in the article. At that time, the Internal Revenue Service had an audit team in Los Angeles. As they often do, they'll send an audit team to deal with an industry. And in Los Angeles, obviously, they had an audit team deal with a bunch of issues that were coming up in the entertainment business.
Sure.
And this caught the eye of the guy who was the head of the audit team.
Right.
And so everybody started asking around, and everybody said, you want to know anything about tax planning in the film business, go check out what Hoffman's doing over there at Carolco.
Right.
So they started their audit, both of Carolco and of Vina and Casar, and they then, tried to tax Andy on the $110 million, making
Right.
it subject to U.S. tax. They
Right.
screwed up this, terribly. They actually knew they were going to lose, and so they decided the solution was to find something with me, and therefore they had the CID come in, go through my returns, and they did find a mistake that my accountant had made in the return, and they decided that was going to be the basis of criminal charges against me.
So this was a legitimate mistake. Humans make mistakes. A legitimate mistake that was made not by you, but by your accountant. And they decided to make an example of you and charge you, even though you were willing to reconcile the mistake?
Yeah, sure. I went and paid the taxes once they brought it to my attention. The
Yeah.
accountant that it was a mistake because of the W-2 that was prepared by Carolco, which the Carolco accountant said, yeah, it was my mistake. I did it. My accountant said, I screwed up. I should have seen that. Peter didn't have anything to do with it. They had all that testimony, which is why ultimately I was acquitted in the case. But, they decided that, just putting this criminal case out there would have the result they wanted, which was an interim effect. I tell the story that Tony Scotti, who was on our board, he had just sold his company, All American Television, for $100 million. And I ran into a nappy and he said, Peter, I just want you to know, in light of what happened with you, I just paid my taxes.
What you're saying is that the IRS wanted to do something that would have a prophylactic impact on other future deals. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. They wanted to make sure nobody did what I did, but more importantly, nobody would want to, deal with anything that I had done. Making, I think Reg Gibson later told me that when his son was applying for a job in the U.S. Attorney's Office, they said, "Oh, is that Reg Gibson? Is that the guy who's partners with Peter Hoffman?" And Elliot said, "Sure." And he said, "We're going to get him. He's on our sites. We're going to get him." They just decided that I was a public enemy number one because we had done all these deals.
Right.
And Andy's deal, in my opinion, was a work of art. I mean, it was one of the best things I've done.
So
And so they just decided this was a way to stop it, and it works. That
Right.
things work.
Of course.
Nobody
Yeah.
wanted to do that deal again. That's right.
Ever, or at least for a long time. So, Peter, now the question becomes: you're in a tremendously difficult fall, and what are the consequences to this I
Well,
guess
the funny
vendetta?
thing is that that case really didn't have that much in the way of consequences. I won the case because it was in LA. The jury didn't buy any of this. They saw what it was from the beginning. And as I
Right.
like to say, that the revenue agents who testified in the case testified honestly. And since they testified honestly, everybody could see there was nothing there.
But when you
So
say
the
you
government,
win the case, you can win a case, but it costs tens of thousands of dollars of money and time and effort, and there's reputational damage. Is that true?
of course. But in that case, again, I was supported. I was had in the middle of my Paramount deal. I called Sherry Lansing and she said, honey, we're with you. We're sure that everything will work out for you. She indulged and didn't bat an eye. And
Okay.
so
So then what
that,
happens?
well, so, then of course, once that got done, then the government had to deal with the problem of settling Andy's case. And
Right.
at that point in time, they then had to essentially surrender.
Right.
And you know, so what happened was Andy said, "Look, I want to get a former IRS commissioner come in. I want him to put what you did under the microscope to make
Right.
sure that what it is correct." And I
Right.
had a meeting over at Irela Manila with that guy. I can't remember his name now.
Yep.
And we went through it. And my memory is he said, "Wow, that's brilliant. Yeah, they're dead," and they were. So they settled for pennies on the dollar with Andy, and but that still made me somebody that the government didn't like.
A
Because later,
target. When you beat the government, they don't like it, so you become a target.
yeah, later when, the big problem I had was later in Louisiana dealing with
Right.
these state infrastructure tax credits. When we first found we were under investigation for
Right.
credits that the state had granted, the state re-granted them. All right. The state had said these were not subject to review, yet
Okay.
the federal government was charging me with stealing state tax credits that the state said I was entitled to.
And what
So
happened in that case? And what happened
what
in that?
happened was I hired a local DA who was a well-known guy. I said, go talk to them because look, they say we stole credits, but the
Yeah. Go ahead.
post-production center is done. It's in service.
Right.
We got the Super Bowl there. We got True Detective in the
Right.
facility.
Right.
What's the issue here, right?
But that
And
what happens with the case? I want to know the
well, let
conclusion.
me just finish this part of it, and then I'll tell you. So he goes there, and the assistant DA, he says, why don't you go look at the building? It's beautiful. You can see there's actual people in there and they're doing everything they said they were going to do. To which this person said, we know all about him. He got away with it once. He's not going to get away with it again. We don't need to see anything.
Right.
All right. So they then tried me for federal wire fraud for allegedly stealing state tax credits to
Right.
which I was entitled.
Right.
And the whole thing was just, as one lawyer called it, a shit show. And I was convicted of that based on false testimony,
Right.
as we've established.
And
They
what was your penalty or sentence for that?
Originally it was probation because the judge himself had said, I haven't disagreed with a jury verdict in 30 odd years on the bench until this one. He knew we were innocent. In the
Okay.
restitution
So you
hearing,
got a
it
you got a
found.
you
Go ahead.
originally got probation.
Yeah, and he had found in a restitution hearing, quote, no victim and no loss, right?
Okay.
Nevertheless, we got this terrible judge on the Fifth Circuit, a hanging judge who's no longer there. And he decided that all these white collar criminals are getting away with all this stuff and causing all these losses. And he reversed our sentence and basically told the lower court judge, you got to sentence him to prison. So I was sentenced to 20 months, but in the federal system, that basically means a year. And that usually means 8 months in a federal penitentiary and 4 months in, this halfway house. And that's what happened to me. I had 8 months at Terminal Island and 4 months at a halfway house in Watts.
And Peter, what did you learn? This is a fall from grace that is tremendously hard to understand for most people. What did you learn? What did the experience teach you? Because that's part of the book.
It is. And there's the level where you can look back and say, gee, I should have done this differently. I should have done that. Followed my wife's advice to never get involved in doing the post-production center in New Orleans. Why did I need to do that? I mean, maybe I made a mistake with who I was in business with. And those things are all valid things.
Yep.
And there are a lot of known unknowns and unknown unknowns, as our former defense secretary liked to call it. And you only have a limited ability to see that, and I probably should have seen it differently than I did. But
Yep.
when you go through the things, the main thing that affected me was what it meant for me as a person, and I think it allowed me to reflect a lot on my life, what I cared about, the things that were most important to me, and to find some strength in it. My wife said to me, and it's in the book, and I said, "What does this all mean?" And she said, "This is really a test to see how strong you are. Are you strong enough?" And that was really it. Strong enough to pick myself up, go back and earn money for the family, protect the people that I loved, and it happened. Worse things have happened to other people. It was perhaps fate. Perhaps it was something I needed to learn. Perhaps it was, as the title suggests, too smart for my own good, that kind of thing. Which I'm happy to say, sure, why not? That's a perfectly legitimate thing to come out of it with. But the thing that mostly I liked was that this was a way to get strong and, realize that this is what I needed to come out of this, is to be stronger than the people who persecuted me.
Peter, why did you decide to write a book?
When I was in Terminal Island, Red Gibson, my partner, and Susan, my wife, and Slava Vladimirov, this guy who's a banker who's a good friend of mine, they all said to me when their visit, you got to write this. You got to write your memoir. You have so many stories. You got to write about it because I think that'll help you go past the time and, to feel good about what you're going through. And I started writing it. And as I did, Susan had suggested that we approach it like the Bardo death experience in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which was the theme of Jacob's Ladder, and kind of use that as a way of the Bardo when you're still alive, but you're flashing back through your life, trying to see things with a clarity that you didn't see at the time, and to try and see what of that you really are supposed to internalize. Because a lot of exterior events are just exterior events. Whether you made $1 million, whether you made $5, whether this movie was successful or that movie, that's of course events. But what it means to you, how you internalize it, what you make of it, that becomes then the focus, and it allowed me to focus on all these events of my life. And I'm very excited. I had a very exciting life, and really enjoyed it, and very, very thankful for the opportunities and people I've had in it. And so I came out of it, in my opinion, a stronger person. And the memoir is really that way of showing that, way of stating it, and also honestly to tell the story of how ridiculous this prosecution in New Orleans was. And I know if they had done that in Los Angeles, I would have been acquitted again. But it was a jury of people out from Metairie, and the prosecutor just lied through his teeth, and
Right.
they just prejudiced the jury, these thieves from Hollywood, right?
So I want to ask you two remaining questions. What did you learn from the writing of the book? Writing a book is a very interesting, unique exercise for an individual, particularly one who's never written one before. What did you learn from that experience?
Well, I mean, part of it is just the form of self-expression, how you can express yourself in an objective way that doesn't come across as too egocentric or, let's say, focused on unnecessary details, and try to present stories in a way that would be interesting to the reader. We do this in the film business all the time. You can be a genius in creating something, but if you have no audience for it, for the film business, what are you doing? You have to have an idea that you're allowing the audience to participate in what you're doing and to get pleasure out of it. And so I wanted to find a way to, take my self-expression and to do it in a way where I could, reach people, where they could kind of feel a sense of sympathy for me, feel what I was going through, share the experience that I went through, in the hope that they learn something from it, or it's just an interesting addition to their knowledge.
All right, my final question, Peter. I'm going to try to make this one a yes or no, but you may not submit to my cross-examination. Do you hope someday that this book becomes a movie?
No. My wife keeps telling me that's what we're going to make it a movie. It's a great movie, and I just, I don't see it as a movie. I see it as a self-reflective piece that people should read in the privacy of their home and hopefully get something out of it.
Peter, you have been an exceptional partner on our expedition today. I'm very grateful to you. And there will be people watching this show all over the world. Some who will have known who you are, some will not. Some will be interested in your book, others will be interested in listening to your words of wisdom. But I thank you. You were a wonderful, transparent, authentic, and vulnerable guest for Without Notes. I'm very grateful to you, Peter.
My pleasure, Michael, and thank you for having me on. This is a good part of the process for me.
Friends, Without Notes today had an exceptional experience with Peter Hoffman, a Hollywood icon. And what I particularly appreciated in Peter's conversation was the vulnerability and transparency. I hope you did as well. Now, we ask our audience to do 4 things to assist our endless Without Notes journey, and that is if you liked the show, please like the episode. If you want to share, comment, and subscribe, these are all ways of you assisting the concept of real, authentic conversation without notes, and we would be very appreciative of your help in that way. So please like, share, comment, and subscribe. I'm Michael Levine. We'll see you on the next edition of Without Notes.